listening to Inside the Rings, your ultimate podcast destination for everything related to the Olympic movement. Here's your host, my dad, John Hawkins.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Inside the Rings, where we uncover the untold Olympic moments, the stories behind the glory, and the thinkers who helped shape what the games stand for today. I'm your host, John Hawkins, and today we're going to light the torch for history with a very special guest. He's an award-winning author, screenwriter, and Olympic historian. He's best known for his riveting novel, which I personally love, The Idealist, which breathes life into the founding of the modern Olympic movement. Please welcome George Hirthler. George, welcome.
Thank you, John. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
It's great to have you. So, George, you've been described as the modern keeper of Pierre de Coubertin's flame. So before we dive into that history, I want to ask you, what was your first Olympic memory and what lit your personal torch?
Pierre de Coubertin lit my personal torch when I found out that the games were more than just a sporting event and they were a movement. But going back, since you asked, my first Olympic memories, when I was a kid in the 90s, I'm pretty old, but when I was a kid in the 1950s, Wheaties had a guy named Bob Richards, who was the U.S. pole vaulting champion and the Olympic pole vaulting champion. I'm imagining now, I didn't check this out, or in Helsinki, maybe 1952. And he was on the box, and the Wheaties was called the Breakfast of Champions. And I loved to eat it because, I wanted to be a champion like everybody else.
Right.
Bob Richards was appearing on TV here and there, and I think he was a reverend, but he was this incredible guy, coat and tie. And then when he took that off and put his track and field uniform on, he was an incredible pole vaulter, and I was fascinated by the pole vaults. Then there was another guy on the box who might have preceded him, but definitely was about the same time, was named Bob Mathias. So there were two Bobs. And Bob Mathias, as a teenager, I think, won the 1948 decathlon. And back in those days, we knew, I don't know how we knew, but we knew that the champion of the Olympic decathlon, I was 1 year old in 1948, so that tells you how old I am. But he also came back and won again and set a world record in 1952 in the decathlon. And in those days, the decathlon champs of the Olympics, and still to this day, were considered the greatest individual athlete in the world. And so I admired both those Bobs. Those are my earliest memories. And then, of course, I was a boxing fan. My grandmother was a boxing fan, taught me to love boxing when she babysat me on Friday nights and we watched the Gillette cavalcade of sports Friday night fights together. And so I followed Muhammad Ali from the Olympics on.
Yeah, no, that's great. And that's similar to my experience, just seeing the athletes on TV and kind of eating Wheaties with these athletes, right? So I love it.
Breakfast of Champions.
That's right.
I think Mary Lou Retton was on. Carl Lewis might have, later they continued. I think Wheaties continued that series. I don't know if they paid them or not, but I think even Edwin Moses was on.
Yeah. Well, that's fun. So let's talk about the founder, right? Those who listen, they know the Olympic rings.
Yeah.
But they may not know the man behind them. So who was Pierre de Coubertin, and why is he such a towering figure in both sport and civic thought?
Well, he was a French educational reformer in the 1980s. When he was raised in Paris. He was born in Paris. Let me talk a minute about his birth date. He was born on January 1, 1863. Mm-hmm. That happens to be the same day in Paris, France. That happens to be the same day that Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation in Washington, D.C. And so as Lincoln, on Coubertin's birthday, signed a document that emancipated and set free the slaves, Coubertin, coincidentally, I don't know, maybe because it was karma, maybe the stars were aligned, spent his entire life in some ways liberating people through sport. And he was one of the first to see, as a young man, he was obviously a brilliant student. He was one of the first to see the possibilities of sport in building and developing the whole human being. And he wanted to bring sport into the French education system because they didn't have sport at the time. He was in a Jesuit school, St. Ignace, on the right bank in Paris, on Rue Madrid, and he'd go into the classroom with the other students, and they'd be in there for 8, 9, 10 hours a day without really any breaks and recess like we know today, and no sports and games. And he traveled as a young man. He traveled to Britain and went to rugby in particular, and admired greatly the work that Sir Thomas Arnold had done at rugby to integrate sports into the school curriculum, and wanted to bring that back for his French compatriots, for the children of France. And at the time, France looked at sport as sort of a derogatory pastime, and didn't really want their children participating in games, didn't think that games were worthy of the culture. But Coubertin helped to convince them that they were.
Now, when you say rugby, you're actually talking about the town
of Rugby,
England, right? Where rugby started and got its name from, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
The kids, evidently a kid named, now his name escapes me, but the boys at rugby were playing soccer on the field one afternoon. And I think this might have been in 1848 or somewhere around there. It might have been a little bit later. And one of the kids was frustrated that he wasn't able to score, and he picked up the ball and started to run with it and ran it into the goal. And Matthew Arnold's son was at rugby and actually wrote down the first set of rules for a new form of what started as soccer, and they named it after the school, which was named after the town.
Yeah.
So Rugby is a town. I took a train up there and walked through the chapel where Sir Thomas Arnold was born when I was writing The Idealist and doing my research on Coubertin, and to see why he was so impressed by this man and this university, the school. It was like a high school. And it really is a beautiful campus with these great playing fields, and the kids were out there in whites. And so he brought back sport from England, and it was in all of course, it was in all of the schools and universities there at the time. And he brought it back into France and started convincing some headmasters at schools, both Catholic and public schools, to bring sport in, and found a few allies and really built the program up in France during the 1980s.
Yeah. Now it's amazing that that's kind of the germ of where it started.
He saw the possibilities. I mean, he saw the possibilities of building sport into education and therefore benefiting in the development of the whole human being.
Yeah.
He knew that if we were repressing the physical side of our nature, we were never going to be full human beings. And although he wasn't an athlete himself, he practiced multiple sports over the course of his life and enjoyed them immensely. And we'll talk about that as we go along, I guess.
What do you think his greatest idea was?
Probably the marriage of sport and education. And for me personally, I mean, if you talk to scholars, I think scholars would tell you, historians would tell you, probably the marriage of sport and education was his greatest idea, but it was something that he picked up. He was a great synthesizer. He could take ideas from here and there and put them together and make them work within the culture he was in and with other cultures, within other cultures as well. But I think his greatest idea then was to see the possibilities of using sport as a platform for peace between nations and harmony between peoples of all nations. And he invented a philosophy of Olympism. And Olympism lays out basically in its core beliefs the idea that we can excel individually. There's sort of a 5-part definition of the Olympic ideal that I've developed that really tracks Coubertin's thinking, that moves from the personal to the universal. And that means we start with human excellence. So if we're an athlete and we work hard and we're good enough to get to the field of play in the Olympic Games, that means we've achieved an international level of excellence.
Yeah.
And out of that achievement, we'll have empathy and sympathy for the people we're competing against from other countries. And Coubertin believed that out of the knowledge that you and I are lined up against each other on a track, and we've beaten everybody in our country to get there, that we will automatically have a measure of respect for each other. Because I'll know that you had to make a lot of the same sacrifices and pursue the same disciplines that I did. And out of that mutual respect, he believed friendship would flower. And he thought that athletes will when they meet, and learn to respect each other, they'll form friendships in the field of play. Those friendships will automatically lead to international understanding. So if you're from France and I'm from England and we're competing and we have respect, we form a friendship. I have greater empathy for the interests of the Brits than I had before we competed. And then he thought that international understanding would serve as part of a platform to unite the world in friendship and peace through sport. So, John, just to boil it all down, his greatest idea, using sport as a platform to unite the world in friendship and peace across all cultures and all the boundaries that divide us.
And, that was very much on display for me personally last year at Paris.
Yeah, me too.
Where the people that I was surrounded by in the events that we went to, it didn't matter what color the jersey was of the players on the field. We cheered for everybody,
That's unique. That's the unique aspect of the Olympic Games. You do cheer for your own country, of course.
Yes.
You want your compatriots to conquer and win, but at the same time, because you're part of this symbolic, literally this global meeting of people from all races. As Coubertin said when he retired in 1925, games are global. All people must be allowed in without debate. And so he wanted everybody there on the field of play because he knew that for the games to succeed and reach his ultimate vision of uniting the world in friendship and peace, that the whole world would have to participate. It couldn't be therefore controlled by politics or governments or anybody who had too much influence over it. So Paris was amazing. That it wasn't just you and me and what we were witnessing there, right? 5 billion people. More than half the world's population, 5 billion people were watching some part of those games as we were enjoying them on the ground.
Most watched games in history, right?
Yeah, by far.
Yeah, by far. So let's talk about The Idealist. So as I mentioned, The Idealist is a novel, but it's a historical novel, right? And
it's historical fiction, yeah. Yeah, it's a historical novel.
So you've done years of research. Yeah, there it is.
There it is, The Idealist.
You've done years of research.
65 pages. Yeah, I've done years of research.
And what made you decide to put this history into a fictional novel?
When I finished my career was spent writing campaigns for cities bidding for the Olympic Games. And the 10th campaign that I did was for Munich. And it was for the 2018 Winter Olympic Games. And we lost to Pyeongchang in Durban, South Korea in July, I think it was, or maybe September of 2011. And I came home and I said to Carol, I had already founded the United States Pierre de Coubertin Committee. I'd spent a lot of time promoting Coubertin and speaking about him and his ideals and his vision for the Olympic Games. And I said, honey, I'm going to write a book about Coubertin now. I'm going to take some time. Might take me a year. It ended up taking 4.5 years. And I'm going to write a book about Coubertin. I remember, and I sat down and I had my computer on my lap in the living room, right behind me here, the same house. And I wrote a page. And it was a scene of Coubertin rowing in circles on Lac Léman, which is Lake Geneva, as a storm blew in from the French Alps. And there was a photograph. I had a photograph of Pierre de Coubertin. You've probably seen it. At the age of 72, out on the lake, rowing in a big, long skiff. And I based it on that photograph. And when I was finished writing it, it was fiction. It was historical fiction. It was absolutely true. It was a scene out of a photograph. He did it. He was behind the Chateau d'Ouchy, which I describe in the scene that I painted. But I ended up realizing I can use fiction to dramatize his life better than I can tell the story just in pure factual terms. Plus, I then had an idea about bringing a journalist in to interview him. He's an old man. I wanted to set it at the end of his life. Yeah. The book opens within 9 months of his death, and I wanted to set the whole thing in that period, but use the interviews that the journalist conducted, a young journalist who's interested in his career, to tell that story. And so I stood up at the end of it, and I read it to Carol, and she liked it, and I said, I'm going to write this as historical fiction.
Awesome.
That's how it happened. It happened in an hour. Like, boom, there it was.
And I imagine... I mean, you're a writer, right? You wrote, as you mentioned, for several different games. I believe you're a journalist before that, right?
I have a journalism degree. I never really practiced journalism. Okay. I did write the occasional magazine article, but I'm a creative writer. I went into the advertising business. I wrote ad campaigns and speeches and And
Yeah.
films, a lot of industrial films in the 70s and 80s helped Ted. I mean, I was a big time involvement with campaigns to launch and promote CNN and headline news and all down here in Atlanta. When Ted Turner started launching his networks one after the other, I was one of the most prominent freelance writers and producers in Atlanta, so I did a lot of work for him.
Yeah.
And I won a lot of awards. And that, that led to the opportunity I ended up having in Atlanta.
And so I imagine you kind of put yourself in the position of this journalist who goes to interview Coubertin.
That's right.
Right? Yeah. It's a great book. I urge my listeners to go read it.
Thank you, John.
Yeah. It's a fun read, actually.
Because I was writing about an old man, I wanted to bring a young French journalist in who happens to have been an athlete. He was a Tour de France rider, and he has an American girlfriend who's a painter who he brings, and she gets involved with Coubertin and starts painting his portrait. And so it's this young couple interacting with this old guy, and his wife is she's a bit angry at him because he spent all their money launching the Olympic Games and they're broke at the end of their lives. It's not a pretty scene in some ways. And yet here's this guy who created this great institution that is having a major impact all over the world by the time he dies. And as he is dying, of course, he dies in 1937. The year before he dies, the Nazis host the infamous 1936 Berlin Games. They come in and take over the games and use it as a propaganda platform. And he has to deal with that at the end of his life, where he's created this whole platform to unite the world in friendship and peace through sport. And he can see, because he's a great historian in his own right, he wrote a 4-volume history of the world, he can see that the Nazis are leading the world to war. He respects them because they're putting more money and more effort into his games than any previous organizing committee. He knows the games are going to be great. He witnesses them from a distance. He declines Coubertin's invitation. But the complexities of that moment in his life were so enthralling to me that, that became sort of subplot in the book, how the Nazis tried to entice him to come, how he turned them down, and how he was countering, that's a fictional part of the book, how he was countering their desire. Hitler wanted to take over after the success of Berlin 1936. Hitler literally wanted to take over the Olympic movement, move its headquarters to Berlin, and make sure it was nothing but Nazis from that point on.
Yeah.
And in my novel, Coubertin parries that effort.
Yeah. So you did a ton of deep research. What was one unexpected discovery about Coubertin, maybe the early games, that made it into your book?
Think about the greatest athlete the athlete you admire most for having struggles in his life and overcoming all of these obstacles to get to the podium. Think about that guy and now multiply what he did 10 times, and you've got what Coubertin was able to do in getting the games on the global map. He exhausted his family fortune, the far more considerable fortune of his wife. And what surprised me most, I wouldn't say surprised me, what inspired me most about him is his unrelenting drive, his ability to overcome every obstacle that was thrown in his path. And there was one after another. He said at the end of his life, he wrote this, the struggle, in the end, it all comes down to the struggle, and the struggle is noble. And he felt that what he was doing was worth whatever the personal cost. And he paid a very high price in terms of the sort of family tragedies he had and the money that he spent. But he was just unrelenting. He wouldn't quit. I mean, they launched the games in June 23rd, 1894 in the Sorbonne in Paris, and elect Greece, Athens, Greece, as the first host city 2 years later. Within a couple of months, he gets a message from the Prime Minister of Greece saying, as much as we admire what you're doing and we love the work and we really are thankful that you're restoring the modern Olympic Games, you must know that we're incapable of hosting the Games. And so we're going to have to turn you down. Thank you for this great honor, but as Prime Minister of Greece, I must turn you down. The guy's name was Trikopsis. So Coubertin sails over to Athens and conducts this 1 month PR campaign, giving speeches, writing articles, enrolling the royal family did like the idea, and so they were already engaged, and he built a new organizing committee around Prince Constantine but he just wouldn't quit. So he bent the nation of Greece, more or less, the politicians, to his will and to the arc of history that he wanted to produce. So that's a stunning thing to me, is his achievements in that level. And then if you read the new book I wrote about him this year called Genius of Sport. It's a much smaller narrative nonfiction biography. In there, I document the opposition he faced in France, which I didn't know about when I wrote The Idealist, and that was unrelenting to the end of his life.
And for a long time afterward, right? I mean,
they still hold him in disrepute in some quarters in France.
Yeah, which is so strange because of this global movement that he's successfully stood up.
Thank God that Thomas Bach and the IOC have defended him as much as they have, because the French might throw him right under the bus.
Right. So on that note, Coubertin lived in a world that was really fractured, right? War, nationalism, inequality. He dreamed of this global movement of peace and sport. I think his ideas still hold power today, but what can athletes or even fans learn from Coubertin's values, right? And that he championed: excellence, friendship, respect.
They can learn. I mean, those who participate in the Olympic Games should be instructed in the philosophy of Olympism. They should all become ambassadors of Olympism in their communities around the world. There's nothing more vital in our divided world. I mean, we live in a period of immense conflict. Aside from the wars that are going on, and I'll bet you I haven't looked, but I'll bet you there are probably 50 or 60 wars going and regional conflicts raging right now in our world. We know a few of them that are in the headlines every day. Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and of course the Israeli war in Gaza. And, those are some bloody conflicts that are in the headlines. And here's a movement that has been created to offer a counterpoint to that, to offer values that are about respecting each other, no matter what culture you come from, no matter where the borders of your countries are. And so this movement, here's what the world needs to understand. And this is something I didn't understand until I was hired to write Atlanta's Olympic bid and sent to Switzerland, and discovered Coubertin, and discovered that, number one, this is not just the world's greatest sporting event. It's the world's greatest social movement. And it's a movement of friendship and peace through sport. In the games themselves, the Olympic Games, which 5 billion people watched in Paris, are only the most visible expression of this great movement.
Yeah.
So what we can do to sustain those values today is help people to understand, help those 5 billion people to understand that these games are part of a movement. And the purpose of the movement is to unite our world in friendship and peace through sport, thanks to this genius of sport from France, this visionary guy, 5'3" tall, short little guy.
Yeah.
Who saw the opportunity. So when he was 7 years old, you know this story, John. When he was 7 years old, the Franco-Prussian War broke out. And pretty soon the Prussians were invading Normandy, where his family fled, thinking they would be safe there at their chateau up in Normandy. And they invaded the property and took his tennis box or his croquet box, emptied it out of his sports equipment, filled it with dynamite, and went and blew up the train trestle, the aqueduct that was visible from his chateau. And he was traumatized as a child. And he wanted revenge for his country because they were humiliated in that war. Napoleon III and 70,000 of his officers were captured in Sedan in September of 1870. He wanted revenge to begin with, but as soon as he got into sport, he realized that sport could be a tool for peace, and he saw peace as a better path than vengeance. But he wanted to strengthen the youth of France when he said, I want to re-bronze the youth of our country. That's how he got started originally with the education reform.
What was his favorite sport?
Rowing.
Yeah.
I would say rowing. He said rowing was the most perfect sport. Now, he wrote a letter. He became friends when he came to the United States. He traveled twice to the United States. On the first trip he came to the United States, William Milligan Sloan introduced him to Theodore Roosevelt. He became friends with Theodore Roosevelt. And there's one letter that he wrote, and they corresponded. He was invited to the White House multiple times, never went. They corresponded for years, and he gave Roosevelt a couple of Olympic awards. But one letter he wrote to to Teddy Roosevelt. They agreed that sport, Teddy Roosevelt, when he was New York, he was commissioner or mayor of New York City for a while. He used boxing in the gyms to help troubled youth get back on their feet. And Coubertin wrote a letter to him saying, I just want you to know that I had exercised for 6 continuous hours through different sports. I think he did fencing, he did boxing, he did cycling, he did rowing, he did running. 6 different sports, or 6 hours of continuous sports with no adverse effects to my health. Robust, like robust men. And anyway, but his favorite sport was rowing. It seems to me that when you read his descriptions, he really loved fencing. He tried to invent fencing on horse. He loved riding. Equestrian sports. He tried to invent a sport for the games that involved fencing on horseback, if you can imagine.
Huh, interesting. Almost like jousting a little bit, but...
Yeah, like jousting from the Middle Age, yeah.
Interesting.
Jousting is part of the history of sporting competition between cities and certainly between countries, I guess.
Yeah. Do you think that he would recognize the modern Olympic movement?
He'd be thrilled.
Yeah.
He would absolutely be thrilled. I mean, he would be outraged that there were scandals that involved bribery because, he was giving everything. I mean, his ethic, his personal social ethic, and the ethics of those he recruited to be beside him in this movement that he imposed upon them were all disinterest, no self-interest whatsoever. So he'd be outraged by that. He'd probably think it had gotten a little bit out of hand in terms of its size and scale, but he'd be thrilled that it has such an influence around the world today. He anticipated there was one passage that I read once. He said, I dream of the 26th Olympiad, which was the Centennial Olympic Games that we hosted in Atlanta. He said, I dream of that. So he was thinking about the future. And if, he based his entire concept on the ancient games. And the ancient games, as we know, lasted for 12 centuries. So right now, the modern Olympic Games are still in their infancy.
They're a baby, right?
They're a child. They're not even a toddler yet. And by comparison to the 1,200 years that they lasted in the ancient games. And so Coubertin was thinking probably in terms of millennium, He must.
You mentioned in your book that you write about his initial introduction to the games. It was at is it Ignatius?
Yeah, St. Ignatius was his school.
Yeah, but there was one of the fathers that was teaching there talked about the discoveries from the German, or I guess it may have been Prussian archaeologists of the ancient Olympic Games. Yeah,
the Germans were the leaders of the excavation of ancient Olympia. Although ancient Olympia was lost to humanity for 1,500 years, the location was well known.
Interesting.
And, when the Germans got permission from the Greek government to begin excavating, Coubertin was 11 when this started. It was 1874, and it lasted for 6 years till 1880. The Germans began digging, and they had to clear away 45 feet of sediment from floods. Olympia sits at the intersection of two rivers and at the foot of a mountain, and earthquakes that had a small mountain, a hill. But at 45 feet down, they started discovering, or between 15 and 45 feet, they started to discover statuary and buildings and the columns of the Temple of Zeus. And pretty soon, over 6 years, they had a full plan. They had some information from the ancients on what it looked like and the footprint of it. And they found things that literally paralleled writings from Pausanias in the 2nd century BC in his travels in Greece, where he wrote about ancient Olympia and what an incredible place it was. The influence of the Olympic Games in the ancient world is much stronger in the ancient Greek culture than it is today, because they actually set their calendars in 4-year periods called Olympiads.
Okay.
And there were three other sets of annual games: the Delphic Games, and the Nemean Games, and they were all Hellenic games, so anybody from the Greek nation could participate. But the Olympic Games were by far the most dominant.
Interesting. Yeah, so he became very interested in the archaeology of ancient Olympia.
He visited it after that trip that I told you when he went to solve the problems in Athens. He visited Olympia for the first time on the way back and wrote poetic descriptions of his experience there.
Yeah. Yeah. So looking forward, you've helped carry this torch for a long time, for decades, right? What's next for you? Are there more stories about Coubertin or the Olympic history that you're working on?
I wrote and produced an exhibit on Coubertin's life and legacy that opened in Paris during the Olympic Games, and the IOC is looking at that now as a potential traveling exhibit for, I think there are 35 Olympic museums around the world. And it might travel to those. It might travel to other host cities like LA, maybe Salt Lake City. So we're talking about that, and the family is fully behind it. And the IOC is embracing the storytelling that I did there. I'm going to produce a documentary on him. I've done 4 short chapters that you can watch that are motion graphics, sort of 3 minutes each, on his childhood, the Paris Universal Exposition in 1889, in which the Eiffel Tower rose, and Coubertin was part of that and conducted a symposium there, a conference there on sports. And then, of course, the launch of the Olympic Games. I cover all of those in these short chapters, and I want to weave all that together into a full documentary on Coubertin. But I've just finished a documentary on the Atlanta Olympic Games called The Games in Black and White. It's an hour and 40 minutes. It's the story of Billy Payne and Andy Young, a white man and a black man who teamed up to go chase this impossible quest. And nobody thought that Atlanta would have a chance when we started of winning the Centennial Olympic Games, but we won and brought it home. And that's how I got my start in this game. I was hired as the lead writer on the campaign to bring the games to Atlanta. And this was 1989 and 1990. And when we won, the next thing I know, all the cities bidding for 2000 make a pilgrimage to Atlanta to see how we won. And Billy Payne, who was the CEO of the games then, sent them all over to talk to Brad Copeland and I, my partner and I, and we got hired by Istanbul to write and design its bid for the 2000 games. Wow. And then after Istanbul, it was Stockholm for the 2004 games. Then we did a Winter Games in Klagenfurt. Then Brad and I broke up, and I went on and got hired by, formed a company with Terrence Burns, and we got hired by Beijing to be the lead communications strategist and writers of their bid. And from Beijing, that was for the 2008 games. Then we did Vancouver, won back-to-back with Beijing and Vancouver both winning. And then 2010, then I worked in New York for 2012, which London won. And then I worked 2014 for Salzburg, which went to Sochi. And then I continued to work until 2018 for Munich, where I met Thomas Bach. He was running the campaign. So right now I'm also writing a biography of Thomas Bach and starting to produce another documentary with the IOC on another famous person in the Olympic movement from the United States, who I'll tell you about on the next podcast. But so I've got a lot of work. I've got a lot of work in front of me, and I want to continue to promote Coubertin and talk about him whenever the opportunity arises. So this kind of thing is important to me, and I really appreciate your taking an interest in it.
Absolutely.
Oh, John, there's one other thing that we'd be really neglectful if we didn't talk about, since you're going to be on the board. We're relaunching. 1993, I founded the United States Pierre de Coubertin Committee here in Atlanta. Yeah. And we took on a couple of projects. We built a statue of Coubertin, raised $500,000, built a statue of Coubertin in Centennial Olympic Park, which became one of the most photographed landmarks of the games. People love to climb up on that statue and have their picture taken with this 8-foot-tall Pierre de Coubertin.
It's really 5'3".
He's 5'3", but he's 8 feet of bronze.
Yeah.
And we translated about 800 pages of his Olympic writings into English for the first time, which then became part of the basis of my research into his life and times and reading what he had written. I mean, he left us 16,000 pages of writing, so there's more translation to be done. But that committee then, after the Atlanta Games, sort of went into dormancy, but I kept up my membership in the International Pierre de Coubertin Committee, which was founded in the 70s by a couple of people who really knew him. And I'm on the board of that organization, and I always attend the annual meetings over there in Lausanne, and we talk. It's under the leadership of Stefan Wassong now, who runs the the Olympic Study Center at the German Sport University of Cologne. Anyway, long story short, it'll be 30 years next year since the Atlanta Games. So that little organization has been sitting there dormant for a long time, and we're resurrecting it.
Yeah.
And we're giving it new life in LA with Gary Rhodes. and new life in Salt Lake City with you on the board. And so that is going to occupy some of my time in the days ahead. And hopefully we'll produce a new website where people can learn about Coubertin. We'll produce some lectures and films and sell some books and make sure that the Baron is not forgotten, but Baron is remembered for the heroic contribution that he's made to humanity that not enough people know about.
Right. Well, it does sound like you've got a full plate ahead of you. So to our listeners, some who've never heard of Coubertin before, obviously I think everybody's heard of the Olympics.
Yeah.
Watched some of the Olympics.
Yeah.
What's one thing you hope they take away from not only this conversation, but from the Baron himself?
That the man created a global movement that is got more meaning and relevance to our life and times right now than it did the day he created it. And each year that passes makes it more important, makes the Olympic movement and the Olympic Games their great festival of humanity, their celebration of humanity, which occurs every 2 years, winter and summer, makes it more important to us than ever. I do believe that if it gains enough stature, if enough people rally to it and realize, wait a minute, peace is really a better path for us. Why don't we just invest everything we've got in sport and stop the insanity of this military buildups and conflicts around the world? Why don't we put all of our energy into making this movement strong? If it gains the stature that I think Coubertin believed it could gain, at some point, cities that want to host the games may have to sign contracts that eliminate the possibility of any armed conflict from that point on. It hasn't happened in the past. There is a thing called the Olympic truce that is announced at the United Nations and is supposed to create a truce period around the games, before and after the games, but that hasn't had sort of the moral authority to really stop any country, any political leader from taking his country to war during the Olympic Games. In fact, if you look at it, it's strange to say, but Putin, I think he launched the invasion of Georgia in 2008, the day after the opening ceremonies.
That's right.
Of the Beijing Olympic Games.
Yeah, I remember that.
And there was also there was active. When did he actually invade Ukraine? I think it was right after the end of what games were they? Were they the Beijing?
I think it was Beijing again.
2022 again, the Winter Games?
Yeah. Beijing in 2020.
He sort of, 2022,
yeah.
The Winter Games. He sort of used the cover of those games. It's kind of ironic in a way.
Yeah.
Deflect coverage, I guess.
Right. Well, George, thanks so much for being here. We're going to have you back on. I'd love
to come back on, John.
Passion and your work reminds us that behind every games, behind every medal, there's this idea and belief that sports can change the world. That's, I think, reading what you've written, both in The Genius of Sport and The Idealist, that's a message that rings loud and clear to me. Is that's what the idea is behind the founding of the Olympic movement is let's bring the world to peace through sport and education and better relationships across the world. So
that's a really admirable goal. And I'm glad that you and I are kindred spirits in the drive to help people understand the power of this movement and its promise for all humanity.
Right. So, well, we're going to have you back on, but for the audience, if you loved this conversation today, which I did, don't forget to subscribe to Inside the Rings, leave a review, share this episode with a friend or multiple friends, and stay tuned because we're going to be diving even deeper into Coubertin's life and legacy in future episodes. So until then, keep chasing excellence.
Thanks, you,
George.
John. Yeah. Thank you, man. Thank you. Very enjoyable.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Inside the Rings. We encourage you to rate and share the podcast. And if there is any topic you would like us to cover, leave us a comment. See you next time. Thank you for listening to this episode of Inside the Rings. We encourage you to rate and share the podcast. And if there is any topic you would like us to cover, leave us a comment. See you next time.